Do we know economic trend wise, like what the total addressable market could be in this space the next couple of years? Hey everyone, welcome to our latest TDR Psychedelic Exclusive, a hot topic here this morning. A lot of conversation about this topic amongst consumers, citizens across the world, political leaders, global officials, and it's the war on drugs and how the current system obviously is broke. So, how do we change that narrative? How do we step forward? And what kind of business opportunities this is creating? Because this actually is the next third wave of this industry when you talk about cannabis and psychedelics and how it's going to create a big opportunity both on Bay Street and Wall Street, which is why I'm bringing in my next two guests. He is the VP of Corporate Affairs, Setti Coscarella. Good to see you, sir. How are things?
Good, Shad.
Good,
Always nice to see you again.
good to see you. Ronan Levy, advisor. Good to see you, sir. How are things?
I'm doing well. Good to see you, Shad.
Good to see you. Good to see you. Listen, guys, I wanted to obviously talk about the company that's going public next week, which is Safe Supply and the CSC, and how you're countering this whole war on drugs. And Seti, I want to begin with you. You're no stranger to our podcast. You actually were involved with TAT. You were part of like a great run, took the stock to $6, and now you're looking at a next big opportunity, which is involving in this space. So before we get into the business opportunities, talk about what's the situation that we're in right now when it comes to like the war on drugs, but more importantly, how does this become a business amongst like the conversations you're having with different political leaders and I guess the concern that they have regarding this topic?
Look, I mean, I think if you take a look at what the war on drugs is, it was something that was started about 50 some odd years ago.
Yep.
And like just an extraordinary amount of money has been spent trying to combat illicit drug use. Like billions to almost trillions of dollars have been spent around the world trying to combat this particular problem. Now, over the last number of years, it's not so much the drugs per se, but it's what's being added to these drugs that is becoming extraordinarily problematic. So you're starting to see things like fentanyl and xylazine and a whole number of other tranquilizers that are being added to help effectively cut the drugs to give you the same high, but it costs less to produce the drugs.
Right.
And this is now starting to cause a significant number of deaths. You know, if you take a look at the world a couple of years ago, we shut the whole thing down because of COVID.
Right.
You know, people were dying, and it was a very bad flu. And you take a look at what's happening on this opioid crisis side. There's more people dying from overdoses than ever died from COVID. And I think government is now starting to wake up and say, look, the traditional approach of abstinence has never really kind of worked. If we really want to try to tackle this problem and provide something that has an opportunity to succeed, we need to reframe the problem. We need to provide different solutions. We need to assist these people along a journey. And instead of taking a punitive approach, I think we need to take a more compassionate approach. The money's already being spent. I think for a company like Safe Supply, there's an opportunity to help partner with governments. So in these public-private partnerships to help bring these policies to fruition, right? You know, the key to success in a lot of industries is understanding what macroeconomic trends are going to be.
Right.
And from everything that we've read, everything that's come out of politicians, everything that's in the news cycle now, there is an extraordinary tailwind that's happening in this space. It is a huge problem. Something needs to be done, and we want to be the ones that help solve it.
Do we know economic trend wise, like what the total addressable market could be in this space the next couple of years?
It is almost an immeasurable sum, because if you look at things like testing strips as an example, that's one area that we're looking at potentially making an investment in. The testing strip market is something that's just starting to grow now after it's been descheduled. So for people who are going to take illicit drugs, I think the prevailing wisdom is you should probably test it before you ingest it.
Yeah.
Because there's a high likelihood that some of those drugs might have the potential to kill you.
Absolutely.
If you don't test it, I'm not telling you what to do, but at least test it first, and then you can make the decision for yourself with full knowledge of what it is that you're going to take.
Yeah. Well,
right. And I think that there's an extraordinary opportunity on something like that because it provides a public good. It helps alleviate sort of a lot of the unintended deaths that come from drug use. And I think it can give people an overall safer experience. So, that's just one avenue that we're looking at. And I think the market on that is extraordinary. We take a look at things like coca, we're starting to look at coca leaf processors. So, I mean, I'll let Ronan kind of talk a little bit more about this. Otherwise, I'm going to monopolize this entire podcast.
But Ronan, with your background, obviously, you like Setti said, how do we, your experience being in the psychedelic space, look, Portugal is a great example, right? They decriminalized drugs. What was it, 20 years ago? Crime has gone down.
2001, yeah.
And I'm assuming that when they first had the conversations to say, well, we can't promote people taking drugs. We're not promoting here. We can't fight it anymore. People are going to take what they're going to take. But to Setti's point, how many people have run into a situation where a friend went out, did whatever over a weekend, fentanyl was laced, and you find out they were dead in the last couple of years? That's everywhere.
It's 100% everywhere. And the trends that Setti kind of was alluding to is this is just a continuation of what's been happening over the last 20 years. Portugal represents an interesting example, but California, Canada, almost every jurisdiction in the US, most of them that are somewhat awake, have now legalized cannabis, whether for medical or recreational purposes. We see what's happening in psychedelics. The world is waking up to the fact that what we've been doing around drug policy has been harmful on many levels, right? Like we wake up today, we spent $1 trillion on a drug war, we've killed millions of people, and we're left with a toxic drug supply.
Yeah.
And you can draw a straight line between the current toxic drug supply and the war on drugs, because had the war on drugs not been initiated, had cannabis and psychedelics and the poppy plant not been criminalized the way they were, we wouldn't have needed synthetic opioids that Purdue produced and is really driving a lot of the opioid and fentanyl addiction right now, or crisis right now. So it's all hand in hand. And people are just waking up to that fact. People are waking up to hey, we can't keep the old policy. Not only can we not spend that much money on it anymore to achieve nothing and actually make it worse, we've got to find different ways to make government work, right? And legalizing cannabis and psychedelics and potentially beyond is just an opportunity to create additional revenue sources. I'm a big fan of the legalize, regulate, and educate. We see that tobacco is a perfect example, and Setti will know as well. It's like tobacco consumption in North America is way down, right? Yes, it's gotten more expensive, but we've just educated people about the potential risks and benefits of tobacco, and people are starting to make smarter decisions. And so that's in many, in my view, certainly in Setti's view and Safe Supply's view, and increasingly more and more politicians and regulators' view, that's the smarter approach. And Portugal is an example. We see Colorado decriminalizing, Oregon, California is potentially on the verge, British Columbia is creating a really innovative program around safer supply. So this is happening everywhere. And just going back to how do you put a total addressable market on it? It's massive, right? If you just think about the global illicit drug market trade, it's $360 billion a year. So that's one number you can attach to it.
Think about that.
But then you think about that, the mental health market, right?
Of course.
Is integrally related to mental health. I can't remember the numbers from our old field trip decks, but it's something like $50 billion a year in the US alone in terms of mental health and addiction treatments.
Yeah.
It's like the market is massive. And that's what's opening up as these policies change, as our attitudes towards illicit drugs start to evolve, even the so-called hard drugs, as we become more compassionate and just more practical in terms of our policy considerations. It just makes a lot of sense to move in this direction.
Well, you guys aren't dependent on reform, which is key too, I would think, right?
100%. The addiction crisis that we have right now is not being served. And as different jurisdictions, Toronto, Colorado, Oregon, move to decriminalize so that we're not penalizing people with this, you're going to probably see a shift in the demographics of drug use. And there may be an increase, because people won't be as afraid, which is good. That's part of the policy rationale, because the more you drive it underground, the less you can control the practices, the more you create risks of HIV transmission, hepatitis, overdose without support, ongoing addiction. You bring it above ground, that creates a transition period. A lot more people need support. And that's exactly what we're talking about. And how do you support those people when you work in public-private partnerships, as Setti mentioned, to provide that support, to educate, to provide safe supply, to provide the treatments that's needed to help people who do end up with a dependence on this. It all falls together quite nicely.
Setti, for example, what was it, 3 weeks ago, I was watching the GOP debate, and one of the biggest topics was everything on the southern border, Mexico, and the cartel that's coming over. And it's crazy how much, I haven't been down there, but some of the stories that I've heard and the amount of drugs that are coming across the border is insane. So based off of that, you and your executive teams, have you had conversations with different government officials? Like, what has been some of the feedback that they've said, how much of a priority this is right now for them?
Look, we've had a number of conversations with law enforcement, politicians on both sides of the aisle in Canada, some in the U.S. And when you actually start talking to them, I think it's important to kind of split political theater and public policy,
Yeah.
right? So one side of the aisle is going to argue with the other side of the aisle because that's just their job.
Yep.
Okay? It's pretty much what they get paid to do. When you take a look at public policy, it's a different scenario that becomes a lot more bipartisan. And regardless of the political stripe of the person whom I speak to, everyone basically says, look, this is not a question of if, it's a question of
Right.
when it comes to descheduling drugs. It doing so allows the government and private enterprise like ours to provide the services that are necessary in order to ultimately help people. When you take a look at treatment and addiction, it's not a singular point in time. Yes, there's likely some sort of common destination. However, each individual has different things that they're going to require at different stages of the journey they're in.
Yep.
And I think when you take a look at things like testing strips, or you look at safer supply, or you look at makers of naloxone, or you look at halfway houses and government assisted living and safe injection sites, like they all provide different services to different people at different stages of their journey to ultimately get to a point where they hit recovery.
Right.
Now, in order to get to that common point, I think we need to do a better job of trying to help people stay alive. So if we can provide those services and products to help people along the way, I think that it becomes something that no politician would be able to stand and say, well, that's a terrible idea. Because really what you're saying is, I don't care whether anyone dies.
Well, I
And I
see.
don't think anybody's going to put that on their hands.
We talk about this like the third wave. Like the HHS recommended the DEA last month about rescheduling cannabis, and many believe that's going to happen. As much as there's been a lot of talk over the last number of years, and then you're talking about MDMA perhaps being legalized by the FDA come mid-year next year. So that is a huge step in the right direction on how we look at this differently. So, Safe Supply listing on the CSC next week. Setti, I'll begin with you. Like I said, you were part of the early days of TAT. Trying to get to know better, so that way investors get to understand you more. You've had a lot of actually appearances on Rich TV's YouTube channel, which was actually instrumental in raising the share price up to $6. So why does this deal, being part of this company in the early stages, make sense for you based on your track record?
Look, I think early stage opportunities are where I think the best opportunity lies. I mean, this is something, if you take a look at cannabis or you take a look at psychedelics, purely from an investment standpoint, that's where I think investors made the bulk of their returns. So in this particular case, I'm not looking at this as a functional trade. I mean, that's not really terribly interesting to me.
Yeah.
I think that in this particular case, there's something that helps provide a social good that also gives people an opportunity to participate within the capital market infrastructure. When you kind of position it that way, I think people can feel good about investing in something like this because there's an ultimate good that comes out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? This is why we spend the vast majority of our time trying to engage in dialogue with governments, trying to better understand the policies that are coming out, trying to figure out where the opportunities are going to lie so that we can go in and actually help these policies come to a successful fruition, right? I think, again, like you take a look at the good that's come out of reframing drug use in the last 15 years.
Yep.
Okay. All of this stuff was vilified, but you take a look at the good that cannabis can actually provide.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You take a look at the good, actually, I mean, you reported on it, what the MAPS data was on MDMA.
Right.
You take a look at the good that it can provide. And all of a sudden, the fear behind what will come if you do something starts to wane.
Yeah.
And I think oftentimes policy is driven by fear, and it tends to be irrational and over exaggerated.
Yeah.
Okay. I still remember when cannabis legalized, you had a whole bunch of people that are thinking, oh, everybody's going to be walking around high. I've got 7 cannabis shops within a 3-minute walk of my house. Nobody's high.
Nobody's high.
Okay. Like,
Well, I've often said,
if you like it, you can go and get it. If you don't want it, you don't have to go and get
imagine
it.
if cannabis
Right?
was legal in the 30s and we brought alcohol into the scene. We'd have the
Oh,
exact same
look,
thing, right?
Okay.
Look,
I think
we have different and varying relationships with a whole spectrum of drugs, alcohol being one, tobacco, coffee. Okay. Like, and I'm not trying to use something that is, generally viewed as benign compared to, something that's generally viewed as more harmful. However, reframing the original thought around things like cannabis, around things like MDMA, around things like heroin. Yes, we talked about Purdue before, and you take Oxy. Well, Oxy is effectively heroin. Yes. Can it be abused? 100%.
Yeah.
So can everything else. However, there is something good that can come out of it because it helps people with acute and extraordinary pain. Right? You take a look at what MDMA has been able to do for people that are suffering PTSD, depression, bipolar disorder. It's done extraordinary things.
Yeah.
And I think that there's extraordinary things yet to come from drugs that we otherwise villainized, that if we take a different view and actually start looking at it in a more productive manner, we'd be surprised at what we find.
Well, I will say, like, those are some controversial topics, to say the least. But again, this isn't about legalizing anything.
No.
This is just accepting the situation for it is. If we can't change it, then how do we make it more effective? Which is what a lot of like the company is itself. So when I talk about this business model, okay, for people to understand, Ronan, you will invest and capitalize in what you call the third wave of legalization of formally scheduled drugs. So for our audience, what does that third wave entail? Is it about once these drugs, whether they're legalized or not, it's to everything that we've talked about, where politicians are like, look, we can't fight this anymore. We need to start coming up with solutions. Like, for example, if a young audience is at a concert, they're watching their favorite DJ at Tomorrowland, like, is there safety strips for like fentanyl use that are going to be available at these venues? Like, what does that look like heading into the future?
Yeah, I mean, that's a perfect example. But just before we touch on that, just circling back to your last question about what the business and like the investment rationale for Safe Supply is, it's like back when I started in the cannabis industry in 2013, just about everyone I spoke to, I had terrible eyebrow control, but I'd go into a conversation talking about cannabis and everyone would give me a raised eyebrow and be like, you're nuts. And then, Canadian Cannabis Clinics was acquired by Aurora when Aurora was a $50 million CSE listed company, and it traded up to, I don't know, about $12 billion, right? So over the course of a few years. So, we were right on that bet that was going to be an industry trend. Same thing happened in 2019. I'll use the other eyebrow where we started talking about psychedelics and people are like, you're crazy. There's no way. And, Field Trip started at a $10 million valuation in 2019 and traded up to about $700 million valuation over the course of the next 18 months to 2 years. So we were right. The bets we were making, the assumptions, the tea leaves we were reading about the trajectory of what policy, we were right. And that's the same thing here. And so what investors are betting on is that you're looking at a team of people who have been there at the beginning of cannabis, who are ahead of the curve at psychedelics, who are saying this is the third wave, and we're positioned to take advantage of that. And so what does that look like, going back to your specific question? That does look like fentanyl test strips. Absolutely. It looks like different technologies. There's a number of different technologies that can be developed to ensure the safety of the drug supply. So even though cocaine probably won't be legalized anytime soon, we can at least help people ensure that what they are consuming is safe, and different technologies to make that. A good analogy is going back to the mid 90s or early 90s with condom use. It's like it took a while for people to get smart about being smart about condoms, but it was a trend that caught on because people are like, this is crazy. Why would I take a chance with my life? And the same thing here, right? So seeing safety strips or fentanyl test strips in concerts at universities, all that kind of stuff. Looking at addiction and treatment facilities right now, it's interesting because like it is really hard for people to comprehend, but other known illicit or stigmatized drugs like ketamine or ibogaine
Yeah.
or other classic psychedelics can be effective and potent medicines in treating opioid addiction, right?
Yeah.
So we can actually get people off opioids with other drugs that people think are, also illicit. But that's changing. The medical data with the MDMA, with psilocybin, with ketamine, it's changing. And so there's an incredible opportunity to continue to invest and provide the infrastructure for mental health care, addiction treatment, psychedelic assisted therapies. That's all available right now. We don't need anything to change regulatory wise. But there is also the blue sky opportunity, which is, could attitudes towards cocaine and heroin change? Well, absolutely. We see the city of Bern, Switzerland, proposing to pilot legal sales of cocaine. Again, why? Not to encourage cocaine consumption. That's definitely not it. But by providing clean, safe supply and being able to educate people, you can provide a much more productive, healthy system of drug consumption, which, to Setti's point earlier, it's not going away. It never went away, right? So instead of trying to fight a losing battle, it's important to shift that.
Well, you make a good point, for example, about condom use. I think we can all, we're at the age where we remember where we were in 1991 when Magic Johnson announced that he was HIV positive. That was a huge event and brought a lot of attention to the world. So when I look at, say, a pandemic like COVID, in a lot of ways, we're still kind of close. Like it's only been a couple of years and it's still been a conversation about COVID. Sometimes you're a little too close to the trees to see the forest. But looking back 10 years from now, don't you think we'll look back at this pandemic and say that was kind of like the shifting point and how we look at things differently and how we needed to make change?
100%. 100%. I mean, I had the expression of, I don't believe in silver bullets, but I do believe in silver linings. And I think there
100%.
will be a number of silver linings that come out of the pandemic, even though there's a lot of death and a lot of suffering that went along with it. There is, we learn and we adapt. And I think in many ways that experience will be instrumental to informing exactly what we're talking about today.
We've had Don Murphy, actually, a big lobbyist from Washington for cannabis, on our Twitter spaces a couple times. Probably the biggest lobbyist in the space, but he's just saying, like, look, there is more and more younger people getting involved in Congress. This is a generational thing, and this is what's kind of pushing the narrative forward. So it takes time, but at the end of the day, we are seeing progress. All right, I want to talk about some of the executives with the team. A lot of the members on your team have a background, like I said, in cannabis, psychedelics. Ronan, when our viewers watch this, they're going to look at you as like a person that ran Field Trip. You were able to raise as much as $140 million during your time there. Early stage, there were some challenges, obviously, amongst different companies within the space. So what do you think you learned the most through that experience? And then through those networks of people that you met with, meeting different political figures, different business leaders, how do you stem to benefit from that experience and pave it way forward for obviously being part of Safe Supply moving forward?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, with Field Trip, obviously, anytime there's a business that enters they're restructuring, there are lessons to be learned. But I think foundationally, the thesis was correct. We see it with the MDMA data coming out last week that the psychedelic trend, that need for access to mental health therapies utilizing psychedelics or beyond, is still fundamentally correct. What we couldn't have anticipated at Field Trip was a pandemic that fundamentally shifted the way mental health care was delivered. We were delivering in-person clinical care, and a lot of people couldn't come for a long time. So obviously that's not something that was built into our growth assumptions and projections. The other thing was we couldn't have anticipated that the stock market for biotech and pharma would be off 89%. Certainly that was never anticipated. And we had built projections and plans anticipating access to additional capital, which just wasn't there. But again, the thesis was right. And I think what we're talking about with Safe Supply is just an extension of that thesis, but with a little bit of a reset or regrounding so we can come at from valuations that are more sustainable and grow consistently and responsibly. But the other piece of the equation to the second part of your question is like the appetite and the response we heard from politicians and policymakers around need for new treatments, a different approach to mental health care, to drug policy. It resonated across the political spectrum from left to right. Almost everybody sees that the mental health crisis, which is fundamentally linked to the addiction crisis we're experiencing right now, need new solutions, need new answers. And so everybody was excited by the data. And we're just going to see more of that within the psychedelic sphere. We're going to see more of that in terms of new policy, people point to, Portugal and Oregon and Colorado and these different places. And I think we'll see positive outcomes from it. And that will all feed into exactly what we're talking about in this third wave of drug reform. All of these pieces are going to hang together where people see that it's still the right decision, the right direction. And there's just going to be more and more buy-in.
Well, you make a good point, because I don't think you've actually really outlined that, in the past. But yeah, you dealt with a pandemic with COVID, which not a lot of companies obviously, built their model around, especially, with the clinical model. But when I look at, like you said, the education and learning where we're at prior to COVID, if you brought up the term MDMA, you'd think a street drug. Here we
Yeah.
are, the fall of 2023, and we're now looking at as a cure for PTSD. So clearly, as much as 2019 of fall, which was only a couple months before COVID hit, it's amazing how much 4 years has advanced this narrative, don't you think?
Absolutely. It's amazing to see the public conversation. I mean, we were on in the New York Times, we were on CNN. We had Senator Tom Daschle, a former Senate Majority Leader, as an advisor at Field Trip. So it's changing. Attitudes are changing rapidly, and this is just the next step in that evolution.
Well, if on the flip side of that, early stages, was it 140 million that you end up raising for Field Trip?
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you guys both see, like, look, we are like the victims of this market right now, but however, we're starting to see a turn for the better when we look at stories, like I said, with the HHS, the DEA, the MAPS data. We're on the brink of seeing huge growth, first, second, third wave towards, like I said, functional drugs, as I asked Ronan Setti. But when you look at this opportunity and the overall interest from a business standpoint, outside of the political leaders, what has been the feedback when meeting with like potential investors that are interested in this space, Setti?
Well, look, yesterday I had a call with a network of insurance underwriters, as we're getting our D&O insurance, but a network of insurance underwriters around North America, and basically had an interview similar to this, where they asked a whole bunch of questions, wanted to
Yeah.
understand the business, why do you exist in this and that? And by the end of it, there wasn't a single one that said, this isn't a great idea. Like, I can't see why this won't work. You're actually here providing something that is going to be or going to institute a tangible change in how we deal with a very, very big problem.
Yeah.
And from an investor standpoint, I think that there's an extraordinary opportunity, especially at the early stages.
Yeah.
I agree with you. A lot of this sector, whether you look at cannabis or psychedelics, has been maligned over the last couple of years, but so has pretty much everything else outside of, a few standouts. Now that you're starting to see the data that everyone was championing initially come out as proof,
Yeah.
I do believe that there'll start to be a reversal of fortunes in those spaces, because, as cannabis gets rescheduled in the US, I think it helps solve a number of problems for the MSOs and a lot of cannabis companies in Canada that can now go down into the US and start operating
100%.
in a legalized market. You take a look at what the results that came back from MAPS, and I think that starts to put some wind back in the sails of psychedelics, because everybody's been championing the same things. It's just that, investors sometimes need to see the proof that this is in fact actually the case, and now they have it. So I do think that you'll start to see some reversal in fortune on a lot of the psychedelic stocks as well.
Absolutely.
When you take a look at something like this, I think in general, there is a wealth of opportunity that exists. Yes, initially you start looking at Canada, but every country on earth is in various stages of descheduling, rescheduling, decriminalizing. And that creates a pipeline of global opportunity for us to take a look at early stage companies that start to develop out of the ashes of what was the drug war,
Yeah.
to see how we can reframe and re-attack this particular issue. And again, in a more compassionate humanitarian way. And that creates opportunity.
Yeah.
That also creates a pipeline.
Yeah.
Certain jurisdictions are closer to that than others, but that's what gives you the long tail. That's what builds your long tail strategy in terms of how you're going to go out and find these companies. Every day, there's a new jurisdiction on earth that's going to find a different way to think about how they've otherwise dealt with illicit drugs.
Yeah.
And Canada's, I think, right now at the forefront with this pilot project that they ran in Vancouver on descheduling drugs. What I can tell you is Toronto's had an application in for the last 2.5 years to deschedule drugs in Toronto.
Wow.
Olivia Chow just became mayor.
You're right. There you go.
Okay.
Yeah.
John Tory was the one that put that through.
Interesting.
John Tory was the leader of the Conservative Party.
Yep.
So whenever I get the question of, well, what about, changing political opinions? It doesn't matter which side of the aisle you're on. I mean, I think I saw a tweet from Donald Trump the other day that said he wants to do something about the fentanyl problem in the U.S. and he thinks testing strips would be a good idea.
So are you ahead of the curve amongst competitors? Is there any competitors in this space right now?
I think we absolutely are ahead of the curve, but the very nature of our business allows us to invest in whom you would otherwise categorize as competitors. We're not someone that's doing it at the expense of someone else. I think we're someone that goes in and helps the others that are starting to formulate these companies.
Right.
I know that there's likely 6 or 7 different companies that are going to be coming out over the next 6 to 12 months that will look to raise some capital and go public. And we're in discussions with the vast majority of them, all at different aspects of this new safe supply ecosystem.
Interesting.
When you have that, an industry starts to develop. So if you take a look at cannabis, you take a look at psychedelics, it wasn't built on the back of one company. Okay. Right. There was more than Canopy and Aurora and Tilray and Kronos and Organigram and on and on and on and on. The same thing in psychedelics. I think when you have a number of different companies all generally pushing in the same direction, an industry starts to form. And a sector starts to form. So I think we are absolutely at the early stages of a burgeoning sector. There will be other players that come into the fold. And I think as a collective, we'll be able to create an extraordinary amount of value for our early stage investors and really help governments execute on this overall vision that they've had.
So 6 companies you're thinking will go public over the next 12 months in this space?
Well, I can't speak to whether or not they're going to go public or not. That's on them.
But that's some of the
intentions.
That's some of the and hence the reason why we're talking about a third wave. Let's talk about 2 investments. Canna Labs, licensed by Health Canada, that will be conducting research in MDMA, cocaine, DMT, ketamine, and other psychoactive compounds. And Safe Supply licensing, it's the late stage application process for a dealer's license pursuant to the CDSA to be able to import and test controlled substances to connect investee companies to a federal license for Schedule 1 to 3 compounds. Can you drum that down and simplify that, Setti, and what that means?
Sure. So with those 2 investee companies, one of them is effectively a lab that allows for R&D to be done across a wide spectrum and cross-section of Schedule 1 narcotics.
Okay.
So to really better understand what properties they have, how we might be able to apply them to different use cases, and ultimately figure out the appropriate way to manufacture at scale. The other one, the License Co., is effectively the company that allows you, the lab, to do those testings and handle those drugs. So the License Co. allows you to physically import or possess those Schedule 1 narcotics so that you can do the work that's necessary. And based out of that research, I think we'll be able to help the vast majority of our soon-to-be portfolio companies as they enter into their maturity cycle and really start to look at how they can create the products that society and governments actually need.
Yeah. Ronan, you were part of the early stages of psychedelic space. Do you see this space like it took off like a rocket? Do you see the same thing happening here?
I see the possibility for sure. I think there's going to be a lot of interest and excitement because it's the logical extension of what we saw with cannabis and psychedelics. Again, the thesis around cannabis and psychedelics, it was still correct. I mean, I still stand by that the fundamentals of those businesses will be good over the long term as you see more and more policy reform. And it's the same thing here. The thing that's different here is that there's a little bit more access to immediate low-hanging fruit. And like I said, like addiction and treatment centers are things that are needed now, right? That's not going away. That's just going up and up and up and up. And fentanyl test strips or other technologies to ensure the safety of supply.
I think
we don't need regulatory change.
That's the big one.
These
when
things
you go to you
huge.
brought up the condom thing, like, when you're in bathrooms at nightclubs and stuff like that, who knows where nightclubs are going to be in 10 years. But anyways, it's you get an idea as to where this could be. You're not condoning it.
Yeah.
You're not basically promoting it. But at the end of the day, it's a reality. And if there's obviously something there to save somebody's life, like, it only makes common sense to me versus how are you going to try and arrest everybody when, like you said, this is a model that was created by Nancy Reagan. Nancy Reagan's been dead for how long? 30 years? 20 years?
Long time, yeah. For sure.
Look, I think, the general ethos that I think exists for the company is, look, if you don't do drugs, then don't do drugs.
Right.
If you do drugs, you should probably not do them. And if that's not the case, then at least find yourself with a safe supply.
Yeah.
Okay.
Makes sense.
Whether it's through testing or a clean supply or, any of the stages through the treatment process. I think that if you kind of take that approach, this is not an exercise in condoning drug use.
No.
And it never will be.
No, but it is what it is in the times that we're living in right now. And addiction and consumption is through the roof. And I think COVID just peeled the Band-Aid off and really exposed where we are. And it's only enhanced that. And right now it's like there's no solution in place. And this is why I think government officials are like scrambling to say, okay, let's have conversations because we need something, and we need something like yesterday, right?
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Sir Ronan.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it's important that often when we talk about this conversation, people think about, the addicts living in Moss Park in Toronto or the Lower East Side in Vancouver, but it really is touching everybody. I mean, I think all of us probably know an accountant or a lawyer or a banker or a doctor who started using opioids on a totally appropriate prescription basis and then got hooked, right?
Yeah.
And so it's not just about the fringes of society. This is getting to the heart of kind of mainstream middle class North America. And so I think there's going to be a lot of...
I knew a guy a month ago,
a lot of movement.
Successful businessman, was in marketing, and he went out, had some fun summer night on the Thursday night, and next morning overdosed, dead, fentanyl.
Yeah.
So
it's crazy.
He's got a 2-year-old and a 12-year-old. And it's just like, how many stories have we heard about that? Right. And but anyways, listen, this is going public on the CSC next week. Is that correct? And it'll be under ticker symbol what?
SPLY.
SP as in Peter, LY.
That's right.
Awesome. Well, listen, I know you guys are going to be actually appearing on Rich TV's YouTube channel on Friday as well. So if any of your viewers find this story interesting and want to learn more, what time are you going to be? Any idea what time you'll be on the channel on Friday?
Should be late afternoon.
Late afternoon. Okay. But fascinating story to say the least, but I hope people get a better understanding as to what this third wave is. But there's a lot of momentum building in this space, and it's gladly needed knowing the times that we're in, but the conversations are good. And, I know I was talking about before we started recording, Ronan, about this Netflix series, Painkiller. I think series like that are great to have on Netflix. It's a dark series, but it really opens up the eyes as to like what we're in right now. And that's been going on for 20, 25 years. And if you really want to see how much progress we're being made, we have an app now. It's called Netflix, and it's featuring stories like this now that really educates people. And that to me is progress, right?
Absolutely.
It starts with education, Shad. I think you're 100% right. Otherwise, all you're left with is your own opinion.
Yeah, good point. Gents, best of luck. This should be an interesting one. We'll watch this stock closely, but we'll catch up with you guys next week, okay?
All right, sounds great. Thanks a lot, Shad.
See you in Chicago.
Thanks,
You're putting on is it you guys are gonna be presenting at Benzenga? Is that I understand?
Yeah, there's going to be a panel with Bill, the CEO of Safe Supply, and a few other executives in the space. So it should be interesting.
Would I love to moderate that one? They didn't ask me, but that would be an interesting one. But listen, we'll see you guys in Chicago. But have a great week, and we'll catch up to you next week. Okay.
Thanks a lot, Shad.
Sounds good.
Right, take care, guys.
Yeah. Bye.
What's up, everyone? So what'd you think of the interview? Are there any more questions you want us to ask that you want to learn more of? Then leave a comment below and let us know what you think. As usual, share this video with your network, smash that like button, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel because we would not be here without you. Thanks for watching, everyone.